Committee hearing will come to order. Good afternoon. I would like to welcome the Honorable John W. Lundstrom, Chair of the Judicial Conference Committee on the Budget, and James C. Duff, Director of the Administrative Office of the U.S. Courts. Thank you both for joining us today. Sorry for the delay. Before getting started, I would also like to thank and acknowledge my colleagues on the subcommittee who worked closely with me on the 2020 bill. I think we can all be proud of, and I would especially like to thank Tom Graves for what will be more than a decade of service to the House when he departs in January. I look forward to working with each of you again this year to address the priorities of your constituents and find bipartisan consensus whenever possible. Since this is our first hearing in 2020, I would like to remind everyone that as with prior FSGG hearings, we will follow the 5-minute rule for opening remarks, questions, and comments. Members will be recognized in order of seniority based on who is seated at the beginning of the hearing, going back and forth between the parties. Latecomers will be recognized and mocked in the order of their arrival, going back and forth between the parties. I'll keep my opening statement brief so we can get right into questions. Last year, Justices Alito and Kagan met with us to discuss the Supreme Court's 2020 budget request. I was interested in their thoughts on creating a more transparent and accountable third branch. As I've said before, we in Congress, whether we like it or not, are generally on camera in our hearings. This keeps us accountable for what we say and reflects the democratic process and action for the people we serve. It should be no different in our courts. I'm interested in your thoughts on making court hearings more accessible to the public. Turning to the budget, the Judiciary's fiscal 2021 request of $7.8 billion is $329 million increase over the 2020 enacted level. I know the Judiciary continues to implement branch-wide cost containment initiatives, and we thank you for your judicious use of U.S. tax dollars. However, even with these measures, there are some notable budget increases in the request. For example, the Federal Defender Services Program requests a 6.6% increase, funding 237 more federal defender positions to uphold our Sixth Amendment's right to counsel. Another significant increase is 94 additional staff in the Probation and Pretrial Service Office to assist with post-release supervision. I look forward to discussing the justification for these increases as well as how Congress can help the Judiciary meet its growing needs. I hope this afternoon we can explore our Judicial Conference priorities, which include the request to extend temporary judgeships, increasing funding for the courthouse construction and renovation projects, and the Judiciary's capital security program. This subcommittee recognizes that an effective judicial branch is critical to upholding our democracy, and my colleagues and I will work together to provide assistance where possible. Finally, I would be remiss if I didn't mention my concerns regarding the Judiciary's efforts to ensure a safe working environment for all staff. The new Office of Judicial Integrity arose from criticism that workplace misconduct persists and that employee complaints were not properly handled. We do want to know more about the impact this office has had and what other actions the Judiciary is taking to improve the situation and what we can do to help. Thank you again for both joining us this afternoon, and I look forward to discussing these issues in more detail. Before I turn to Judge Lundstrom and Director Duff, I would like to recognize Mr. Graves for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Chairman, and I know we're starting a little late because of votes. I'll keep it brief, but Mr. Chairman, let me congratulate you and this committee and working together in a bipartisan, bicameral way and with the administration to get the 2020 funding in place, and I look forward to working with you as well this year as we look ahead to 2021. It's been great to work with the chairman. As he mentioned, this is going to be my last season here on this committee, and I look forward to working with you, Mr. Chairman, as we go through all of our hearings, as this is our first one. Judge Lundstrom, welcome back, and Director Duff, we look forward to hearing from you today, and let me just say we appreciate your stewardship of the resources that you have. We know it's limited at times, but we look forward to working with you in the days ahead. But, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Thank you, sir. Judge, you're on.
How's that? Is that better? Thank you. Chairman Quigley, Ranking Member Graves, and members of the subcommittee, I'm pleased to be here to present the fiscal 2021 budget request of the federal judiciary. I am a senior judge in the District of Kansas, but I am appearing today as chair of the Judicial Conference Committee on the Budget. In the interest of time, I will very briefly summarize my testimony about our discretionary appropriations requirements and long-standing cost containment program. I'd like to begin by thanking the subcommittee for the strong and consistent support that it has shown the judiciary. We are especially grateful for the efforts you undertook to maximize the resources available to the branch in the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2020. In several important respects, fiscal year 2020 represents a turning point in the judiciary's recent budget history. Appropriations increases that would have fully met judiciary requirements in past years are no longer sufficient due to significant new cost drivers, including an unusually high number of judge confirmations, rising criminal workload, and large mandated increases in personnel-related costs. Managing the judiciary's resources in the face of these budgetary pressures requires economizing and difficult trade-offs. We will work within our constraints to ensure that the critical operations of the judiciary are carried out successfully, but many of the same dynamics creating budget pressures in fiscal year 2020 will continue to apply in fiscal year 2021. The judiciary's FY 2021 request of $7.8 billion in discretionary appropriations represents an overall 4.4% increase above FY 2020 enacted level. Nearly 80% of the requested increase is required just to maintain current services. I urge the subcommittee to consider the impact of failing to fund these basic adjustments, which must otherwise largely be absorbed by deferring hiring or not backfilling vacancies. Over time, that creates staffing pressures that could diminish our ability to provide necessary services to the public. The remaining 20% of our requested increase is for targeted enhancements. To address rising criminal workload stemming from the prosecutory policies of the executive branch and the impact of legislation like the First Step Act, our request includes $38 million for 515 new staff in clerks of court offices, probation and pretrial services offices, and federal defender organizations. It also includes $1 million for 2 new magistrate judges in districts burdened by particularly heavy workload. In order to ensure that new courthouse projects underway by GSA are ready for occupancy at the time that construction is completed, our request includes $6 million for furniture, security equipment, cabling, and other costs that are not covered by GSA's construction funding. To keep pace with needs for critical security equipment, including access card readers, video monitoring, and screening equipment, where technological failures or obsolescence require action, our request includes $10 million to begin modernizing and advancing toward a responsible long-term cyclical replacement schedule. Lastly, in order to enhance our ability to recruit and retain the very best court-appointed private attorneys, our request includes $300,000 for an increase to the hourly rate paid to attorneys in non-capital cases. This request will allow us to finally achieve the Judicial Conference's goal of attaining the statutorily authorized maximum rate. In addition to the appropriated resources in our request, I would like to touch on our non-appropriated resources, including a variety of fees and multi-year balances. These resources are fundamental components of our annual budget request, and each dollar of requirements that we propose to fund with fees or balances is a dollar that the subcommittee is not asked to appropriate. Finally, I would like to note the high priority that the judiciary places on cost containment. Through our ongoing efforts, we will maintain momentum on our space reduction successes by aggressively implementing our no net new policy, under which increase in space must be fully offset by equivalent reductions. We also continue to evaluate opportunities for future cost savings, such as an ongoing study of whether the consolidation of bankruptcy clerks' offices can save resources while maintaining standards of service. Thank you for the opportunity to appear today and for your continued support of the judiciary. I hope that our discussion will provide you with the information needed to evaluate our request and to allocate your available resources. I ask that you make a part of the record my statement and the statements provided by other judiciary entities on whose behalf we submit requests, and I would be pleased to answer any questions the subcommittee may have.
Thank you, Your Honor. Director Duff.
Chairman Quigley, Ranking Member Graves, and members of the subcommittee. I'm pleased to appear before you today and provide these very brief opening remarks. A more detailed written statement has been provided to the subcommittee. I'm here to present the budget request as Director of the Administrative Office of the United States Courts, which we refer to as the AO for short. For fiscal year 2021, the AO requests $99.8 million, which will enable us to continue our work facilitating judiciary national programs and policymaking processes, and supporting courts, probation and pretrial services offices, and federal defender organizations around the country. The request includes 17 new positions, 2 positions in the Office of Judicial Integrity, 13 positions to improve contract and procurement management, and 2 positions to enhance AO internal controls. I'm also here today in my role as Secretary to the Judicial Conference of the United States to ask for the subcommittee's support for several Judicial Conference priorities that are beyond the AO's own budget and extend to the judiciary as a whole. The first of these priorities is the continued one-year extension of 8 temporary district judgeships whose authorizations otherwise will expire during fiscal year 2021. Without these extensions, affected districts could lose a critically needed judgeship, which will increase caseloads for the remaining judges and slow the processing of cases. While we continue to hope that the authorizing committees will create new permanent judgeships in these districts, we ask that you include the necessary one-year extensions in your fiscal year 2021 bill. A second conference priority for which we are seeking the subcommittee support is the sufficient funding of judiciary space needs within the budget of the General Services Administration. For fiscal year 2021, we request $31.4 million for GSA's Capital Security Program, which addresses serious security deficiencies in courthouses where renovations are viable alternatives to new construction, which of course is more expensive. We also ask that any funds for new courthouse construction be applied consistent with the Courthouse Project Priorities Plan that is in effect at the time the appropriation is made. Lastly, we ask that GSA receive sufficient repairs and alterations funding to begin addressing its backlog of deferred maintenance for courthouses in great need of that. I realize that fiscal year 2021 will likely require difficult decisions as you allocate limited funding to many agencies within your jurisdiction. I greatly appreciate the subcommittee making the judiciary a funding priority in recent years, and I ask for your continued support of the judiciary's priorities and needs. That support directly enables the judiciary to perform its vital constitutional role. That concludes my opening remarks, and I'd be pleased to answer your questions.
Thank you, Director. I'll begin with questions. Judge, I mentioned in the opening the issues of transparency. As you know, currently in the federal courts, the Federal Court of Appeals have the discretion to allow real-time audio and video access to their proceedings. District courts, with only 3 exceptions, have not been permitted to allow any kind of live streaming. Can you explain this rationale and the arguments for and against why would it be more access?
And I think
They can
Director
watch
Duff-
us, warts and all.
Sure. Director Duff can add to that as well, but I think first of all, you're aware that's a judicial conference policy that controls that. It's not something that the budget side or the appropriations side deals with.
We're sending a
It's
message.
The other side, I understand. I think the biggest concern has always been at the trial court level for the possibility of witnesses' testimony being influenced, either witnesses who are unwilling to come forward or reluctant to come forward or whose testimony might somehow be affected by their being on camera. We've had pilot programs in the judiciary in civil cases where that issue we would hoped would be a little less of a matter of concern. But let's take, for example, a sexual harassment case where a plaintiff has come in with a terrible story of what has occurred to that individual. That individual, too, is someone who is reluctant to have that story put forward. So what we've in that public sphere. So what we found is that the parties are extremely reluctant, if not flat out against, having their cases televised. We had a pilot program in the District of Kansas. We reached out trying to get to see how it might work, and we could not get participation in civil cases even because of those concerns. Now, I suppose there'd be some boring contract case that nobody would want to watch anyway, but you know, the fact is we just can't find that interest among participants, and that was the way the policy was. I think that's a good policy at the trial level because of that concern, and that's all I could speak of by my own.
Sure, but in your own experience, with all due respect, you see this taking place at the state level, across the country.
And I have no basis to evaluate it other than my own experience of seeing cases in my own court and how I think that might or might not play out if witnesses aren't as forthcoming and as true to what the facts are as they might be for whatever reason. So that's simply my personal opinion, and it is consistent with judicial conference policy.
I would just add that we did a pilot program, and as Judge Lundstrom indicated, we gave the parties the option for televising the proceedings or not, and over 90% of those cases, the parties, at least one of the parties, said that they did not want it televised, and that influenced the judicial conference as it reviewed and studied whether we wanted to permit cameras at the trial court level. And the reasons are the trial proceedings are really geared to resolve conflicts between two parties, and certainly while the public has an interest in the outcome and observing the proceedings, the primary focus of the courtroom and its proceedings are to resolve the conflicts between the two parties. So that elevates a bit that part of the equation when we consider whether to expand cameras into the courtroom. And it's a little different. I know comparisons are made with your branch of government and its televised proceedings, but voters certainly have an interest in all your proceedings and a stake in it and a vote in it. But in
Well,
courtroom
respectfully, again, I
proceedings.
still think the state courts are perhaps a better comparison. All three branches are equally important, you could argue, and as someone who was a Chief Justice wrote, sunshine is the best of disinfectants. Look, and I suppose if you took a poll of people in the state courts, nobody would want their trial to be televised. You know, this isn't warm and fuzzy good news,
Right.
but it's an important part of what we do as a government. But I appreciate your response. Mr. Graves?
Hey, Mr. Chairman, I had just some questions about cybersecurity and such, so maybe Director, you might be best to answer some of the questions, or Judge, either one. So I understand you're spending about $60 million a year on cybersecurity measures. Maybe you could share with us how many attempts last year, if you know that number.
I can take that, Jim. if you
Sure,
want me to,
that'd be fine,
right.
and I can supplement. We do a tag team.
Okay.
That's all
that's
right.
okay.
And I'll have a series of questions, too, as we go through this on cyber.
First of all, in fiscal year 20, our spending was at $97 million for cybersecurity and $89 million projected for, requested for 21. Cybersecurity incursions have gone up from something in the neighborhood of $9 million in 2016 to over $24 million in 2019. So it is an increasing problem that we are attempting to deal with.
So 24 million attempts.
Yes.
Any successful?
In 19. We don't believe any of them are successful, and that's the good news. And that's one reason that we've spent so much money, obviously, is to keep them from being there, because there is valuable personal information as well as case-related information that has caused anything from nation states to criminal elements to just hackers who like to cause mischief.
So you suspect
wanna get in
foreign governments are attempting to
We get our
Reach the
information from the law enforcement agencies. We are not in a position to so much determine that ourselves within our own resources. But the law enforcement agencies tell us that nation states are among the actors out there.
What is the reason, you think? What is it they're after? What would be the purpose for trying to get information from the courts?
Careful, Judge.
Yeah, I think it varies across the board. I certainly don't know the mind of people who want to engage in nefarious conduct very well. But as I mentioned earlier, there is information, both personal information and case-related information that could be of interest, or there may simply be disruption. To take down websites or cause service to be frozen somehow. It would simply be a disruption of the American government. That might, again, I'm speculating.
Right.
This is.
So the director says be careful in how you answer that question. So
He's just-
why should he be careful?
Well, we would be happy to talk with you sort of line, but we don't want to reveal too much at what all is maybe at risk or vulnerable. And certainly, the opinions of courts are very important, and confidentiality is very important.
So 24 million attempts last fiscal year, none successful. What do you attribute that to?
That 97 million.
Yes, yeah.
And the money we continue to
Is
ask
it
for.
training of the staff?
Yeah.
Is it the software? Is it a third-party vendor? Or what is it that makes this so successful when OPM was not, right?
Well, I think we learned a
areas-
lot from OPM.
Right.
I think we owe a debt of gratitude, so to speak, to the fact that somebody had that difficulty. We start by attempting to have a system that is more difficult to penetrate, and we have done that relatively successfully through beefing up firewalls, using much more encryption, doing things that make it more difficult for people to penetrate the system. Also, and that's mainly software, but there's a hardware component as well. In addition, trying to analyze and determine where people are going and what they're looking for so that we can put in patches that beef up security further. And third, and this is something that I think can't be underestimated, and that is to really cultivate that security-aware culture, that every time we turn on that computer and we log into the network or whatever, what we're doing is now potentially subject to someone attempting to do something bad about. And that has been a educational effort. One of the things that I think cannot be underestimated is the necessity to have well-trained, well-compensated IT professionals. This is something that we're finding more and more difficult, actually, as the private sector is really hiring some of our best people away. And so as we look at our salary increases here, when we look at some of the numbers in there, one of the big drivers is we've got to pay IT people more than what we once upon a time used to pay when the federal government was viewed as a maybe better bet to work for than the private sector.
Mr. Chairman, two quick follow-up questions. So 24 million attempts, I mean, it's a great model then. Maybe you have a good model for others to follow. Out of 24 million attempts, how many people were prosecuted for attempting to enter your system?
That's not in our bailiwick. I don't know the answer. That's something that
One?
I don't know. I have no idea. I don't have any idea.
Anyone? Okay.
I have no
We'll
idea.
just assume none at this moment. And then last question, so Georgia had a ransomware attack on their court system there, and which was very devastating in a lot of ways. What is your policy on ransom? Do you pay it or don't pay it?
We have not had a successful incursion like that. I have no idea what.
We don't have, to my knowledge, we haven't had that experience yet.
Maybe consider it as a policy where
That's
you
good
might wanna
advice.
go.
Yes.
That's good
Okay.
advice.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Tyler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Duff and Judge Longstrom, great to have you here. For the record, I should disclose that Mr. Duff and I have something in common. We both had the eminent great good sense to marry girls from Lackawanna County, Pennsylvania.
We did.
Nice
Thank
to
you.
see you again
Nice to
here,
see you.
Jim.
Thank you.
And Judge Lundstrom, I'll reveal to you that I was speaking to one of your greatest fans on earth, Judge John E. Jones III, before whom I was lucky enough to practice before I came to Congress.
He's a great guy and a great judge.
You won't get a fight out of me over that. One thing we've been talking about over the years is the issue of judicial misconduct and how we're going about policing ourselves with that. And Mr. Duff, in your budget request, you asked to increase staffing, you just testified to,
Yes.
in the Office of Judicial Inquiry by 2 people. And my understanding is that the Office of Judicial Integrity largely functions by explaining to employees the resources available to them. Is that more or less correct?
It is, and it was set up as an outlet outside the individual courthouses and
Sure.
outside the circuits, so we were...
Well, here's where I'm going with that.
Okay.
I don't mean to cut you off.
Sure.
What I'm interested in is what you're doing to give employees a reporting mechanism that reflects a judiciary-wide commitment to changing the culture.
Thank you for the question. It's something that's one of our top priorities, and the Chief Justice identified it in his year-end report in January 2018, and we've been working very hard on it since to provide employees with more sense of security. We can still make improvements in this, I know, but and also a sense that they could get counseling or advice or suggestions for remedies outside their courthouse. That's why I mentioned the Office of Judicial Integrity was set up in our offices here at the Administrative Office of the Court, so that employees who might be otherwise intimidated in their own local courthouses could seek advice and guidance in our offices. And so that office was set up to provide assistance and work with the courts and the mechanisms that currently existed. Now, we've improved those mechanisms too. We've improved the EDR processes with a new model EDR plan that courts are adopting. We've improved and streamlined the Conduct and Disability Act procedures and processes. And you asked about what we've done for reporting and training. We've increased enormously the training that we're providing to our judges and to our employees as to what outlets they have and remedies they have. And it's we're committed to it.
And we'll follow up
Sure.
later in my office on that. I want to move on. Right now, regional judicial councils and the Judicial Conference interpret federal law as prohibiting the investigation of misconduct by federal judges after they're retired. So my question is, how can the judiciary adequately police itself and really understand the scope of the problem with misconduct if these investigations are curtailed in that fashion?
Well, there are a lot of elements to that question, but if a judge leaves the bench before an investigation is either completed or before there's, well, there are a number of answers. It doesn't curtail any criminal investigation. If the judge had been engaged in criminal activity, that, for one thing, is we would refer that to the Department of Justice. And that sort of investigation does not evaporate upon the judge's resignation from the bench. I think what you may be referring to is that if a judge resigns, the Judicial Conference's jurisdiction, if you will, over that judge, and the Conduct and Disability Committee's jurisdiction over that judge is no longer in play. So we lose jurisdiction over the judge for investigative purposes for within the judicial branch. But that doesn't eliminate the, as it said, criminal investigation that might occur, nor, in fact, does it eliminate the power of the Congress and the House of Representatives to conduct an impeachment hearing. In fact, we had a judge who resigned, and we no longer had jurisdiction over the judge and his behavior. But we nonetheless, even after his resignation, referred the matter to the House Judiciary Committee for its consideration of impeachment. The House Judiciary Committee didn't pursue it, but it could have. So it's a little.
Thank you for that. My time's expired. I
I'm sorry.
appreciate your comprehensive answer, and gentlemen, thank you for being here. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to the ranking member and to both of you for being here. I have a very quick question. Before I do that, I might mention one thing. My brother's an Article III judge.
District of Utah.
Yes, I remind him almost every week that his life is a lot better than mine. But it's given me some insight into your work and the stresses and the challenges that you do have. Very quickly, I want to follow up with Mr. Graves' question, but again, kind of quickly, because I have something else that I want to discuss with you, although my second question may be yes or no, and you may not have much input to it. But regarding the the IT challenges, which we see throughout the federal government, by the way, particularly in some of our intelligence community organizations who have an enormous challenge in trying to man those. Have you reached a point where you can't get the people that you need, or are you able to adequately staff even though you're not able to compensate with the Googles and Facebooks of the world?
May I
You
answer?
go ahead,
I don't know that we're at the point where we can't get people we need. We're not. We are in deep competition with those who can pay a lot more. And so, while I think the quality of people we get is still good, we need to be competitive there, and it's an important. The challenges we're going to have in the years ahead it would be setting the salary levels for these employees, and how can we bump them ahead of other employees' salaries, and we may have to.
Well, and at some point you really can't compete with it either. I think you have to appeal to people's sense of duty and patriotism. Hey, I'll go work for Google and make a lot of money in 5 years, but in the meantime, I could serve my country, and I think that's sometimes effective with people.
Yes, sir.
I have a question again, and it may be something you go, look, it's just outside of our responsibility, but it troubled some of us, and that is the Code of Conduct Committee with their opinion of, I think last February, saying, we don't think it's a great idea for federal judges to be a member of the Federalist Society, but if they want to be a member of the ABA, we're okay with that. And some of their justification was just frankly made no sense at all. To say that the ABA is not a political organization is, just nonsense. I mean, for heaven's sakes, they have a lobbying office here in D.C. They publicly advocate all the time. They have a public involvement office. They file amicus briefs. And the Federalist Society doesn't lobby. I mean, they're an education society with a certain point of view. And I'm wondering, do you have any responsibility over that? And do you agree with that opinion? And how would you suggest we respond to that? Because I just think it makes no sense at all.
Well, it may be of some relief to know that opinion is not a final opinion yet. It's an advisory opinion draft, and we've circulated it internally among the judges in the branch for comment, and it's as an exposure draft. So we will be receiving comments over the next 120 days about it, and it will be reevaluated at that point in time by the Code of Conduct Committee, and ultimately, potentially, I should say, by the Judicial Conference. So it's not a final opinion.
Yeah, and I understood that, and that's one of the reasons I wanted to bring it up. And I would ask you to do one thing, if you would, and that is to consider that the value of the judiciary is it's one of the few organizations or institutions that is still viewed as kind of outside of politics, as a non-political body, as it needs to be. And I think my brother's his conduct about how careful he is about not. I mean, he separates himself entirely from my work, and he should. In no way is he ever associated with any political activity at all, as he should. But I fear this opinion diminishes that to a significant degree. And I just don't know how you could justify saying, you know, the ABA is fine, but this other one's not. And if you want to be viewed as being non-political and nonpartisan, I think that damages it enormously. And you would have a lot of questions from people in Congress to say, you got to come justify that to us. And we hope you would share that concern with your colleagues and federal judges.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Thank
Appreciate
you.
what y'all do in your service.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Kirkpatrick.
Thank you, Director Duff, and thank you, Judge, for being here today. As you both may know, I represent a southern Arizona district that borders Mexico, and so a great deal of my time is spent on immigration issues, and we've certainly seen an increase in the number of people coming across the border, I think in a large part due to this president's administration's policies, which I consider to be inhumane immigration policies. I've been at the border. I've met with those people. I've watched. Some of them have to camp for days before they can be processed across the border. And I just wondered if you would each just touch a little bit on how courts in Arizona and elsewhere along the border have been impacted by such an increased workload. And how will this budget request help make such a workload more manageable?
Thank you for that question, Representative Kirkpatrick. And by the way, my sister-in-law and brother-in-law are Tucson residents, so I get down there from time to time.
Well, we welcome you. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll come by sometime as a shirt-tail constituent, I guess. You are absolutely correct in your perception of the workload on the border courts. The 5 border courts, the 2 Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, which is in the circuit I'm in, and California Southern, have over 50% of the felony prosecutions out of the entire 94 districts in the country, and over 40% of the Criminal Justice Act appointments, and over 40% of the pretrial service reports that have to be done. So those are huge numbers. One of the big problems we have is not enough judicial power in those districts. And we would hope that at some juncture there would be some relief on that front, because I think that would go a long way towards helping. This budget, obviously, that we're asking for takes into account, as we compute what the workload is for probation and pretrial, for defender services, which is tremendously impacted, and clerks' offices who have to process all of the electrons, not paperwork, I guess, but electrons that go into so much of this. And that is all factored into the budget request that we're making. And so we are very attuned to trying to alleviate those problems as much as possible.
And I would just add that there are, not only in this budget request, but over the years, we've asked for new judgeships, that not only just, a lot of our requests have to do with either filling vacancies, but creating new judgeships where the courts are most overworked. And certainly our border courts are among the most overworked courts in the country. I mean, we justify a new judgeship request with a caseload of about 430 cases per judge, and we have judges carrying well over 700 cases a year, which is just an impossible task for a judge. So we've devised some mechanisms of inter-circuit assignments and moving judges to help out, but it's a Band-Aid on a real problem. So we do ask for new judgeships and have over the years. It's been a long time since we've had any, but in the meantime, we ask for emergency relief in some situations. So.
Well, I appreciate the difficult task that you have because I see it practically on a daily basis. My follow-up question has to do with personnel. So as you mentioned, you have a lot of paperwork you have to process on each case. Mm-hmm. And do you feel like you've got adequate personnel to do that? Are people willing to come and work on those cases? And where do you recruit?
Mm-hmm. In terms of the situation numbers-wise, although the funding for FY 2020 was much better than we were afraid it might have to be because of the dynamics of things, we're still in a situation in which many of our districts are not funded in their clerk's offices and their probation offices to the levels that they really ought to be, to keep people from working overtime and doing jobs that maybe, if that's a chronic problem, might really be an issue. And in the federal defender's offices, where the appropriation level was actually better in terms of being able to fully fund the requirements that were presented in some respects there, they need additional people in the federal defender's offices as well, because that is really hard work and a lot of high volume work. So the answer is we're doing our best to get by, because we have to, I mean, that obviously, but we need more resources, and that's why we've asked for them in this budget, where we've asked for something in the neighborhood of $38 million additional money for personnel across the clerk's offices and probation and federal defenders.
Well, thank you. My time's about to expire, but I want to thank both of you again, and certainly have my support because I see your personnel in the field and what the tasks they're addressing and the challenges that they're facing, and it's not going to go away. So anyway, you have my full support. Thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you.
I'll pass that on to my in-laws.
Oh, please do. Please, thank you.
Thank you very much, and welcome again to you, Mr. Duff, and to Judge Lundstrom. There have been significant efforts to diversify our federal judiciary. Of course, that remains a long way to go. And one area that perhaps deserves some serious attention is judicial clerkships.
Yes.
Clerking on a federal court allows great learning opportunities and a chance for young attorneys to directly influence the interpretation of our nation's laws, and the decisions that are made as a result of their work impacts hundreds of millions of people in the United States and abroad. And law clerks are often on the fast track to judgeships, to positions in academia, and high-profile attorney positions in and out of government. Are you concerned about the potential impacts that can result from a court that does not reflect the populace that it serves? And what role do you feel the judiciary should have in promoting diversity in its clerkships, and what efforts have you undertaken to make the bench more reflective of the populations? And further, have your efforts to recruit more minorities into clerkship positions been successful, and what, if any, resources could Congress provide to you to help you make progress in that area?
Well, thank you for the question, and it is an issue that is another one that's high on our priority list. We have a 5-year long-range planning process within our branch, and that is one of the goals in our 5-year long-range planning. It's specified and elevated to a very high level of goals within our long-range planning. And we do engage in outreach, and there are a number of programs that we've been working with, Just the Beginning Foundation, the Congressional Caucuses, the Affinity Bar Associations, Minority Corporate Counsel Association. Ann Williams, who was a judge in Seventh Circuit from Chicago, left the bench. I've been working with her recently and on efforts to recruit, and we're trying to start at internships, bringing people in for the summer, getting them exposed, getting judges exposed at that level, and trying to build a pipeline to see change.
This is throughout the country?
Yes, sir, it is. And so it's it definitely is in our focus, and I wish I could report to you better results from the efforts so far, but I think we're going to see them eventually. Right now, we were talking about this earlier today, Judge Lundstrom and I I think where we are right now is actually reflective of, if you look at the number of minority lawyers in the profession, the number of minority clerks that we have is about a match for that. But we'd like to do better. So I would say it's not just a judicial branch challenge, it's a challenge for the profession as a whole, and it's important.
Okay, let me talk about access to the courts for a moment. Mandatory employment arbitration is now the most common method to adjudicate worker rights. And over half of the non-union private sector employees are subject to mandatory arbitration provisions. In companies with 1,000 or more employees, that jumps to probably 2/3. Often the employee has little room to negotiate and has to either agree to the provisions or walk away from the job. And often this takes place after they've accepted the position and quit their previous job. Do you believe that everyone should be entitled to access to the courts and due process? And what can Congress and the Judiciary do to ensure that everyone has adequate access and due process?
Thanks, Jim. It's our role as judges to apply, especially at the trial court level, but throughout the judiciary, to apply the law as it is. And to the extent that the law permits, requires arbitration, we deal with what the law is. And I think to the extent there's a lack of comfort with what the law is, that's fully within the realm of your body to address that. But I really don't think we want judges to be making the laws. We want the judges to be trying to apply those laws as fairly and as even-handedly as we can. So because we sort of play the hand we're dealt. And but you've identified some issues that I understand where you're coming from.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you both for being here. Last year, during our Supreme Court hearing, Justice Kagan testified that the Chief Justice is studying the question of whether to have a code of judicial conduct that would be applicable only to the United States Supreme Court. I'm bringing this up because I am extremely concerned that the judiciary isn't doing enough to protect victims of harassment, specifically sexual harassment. Since then, we've learned that September, a judge in Kansas was found to have committed not one, but multiple acts of serious judicial misconduct, including sexually harassing an undisclosed number of victims, undisclosed number of times. One of the most troubling things for me is that no one came forward. The victims were too afraid to come forward. The witnesses that could have potentially come forward on their behalf did not come forward. Other judges that might have been witnesses, or if they didn't come forward, then I have to question whether they were also party to that harassment. Besides being a moral and ethical issue, we have a responsibility to our employees to protect them. And I'm wondering why no one is coming forward. What barriers still exist that are discouraging victims? I don't know how we bring in interns in this environment. I don't know how we can say we want to be a diversified and more inclusive court system, judiciary system, if we don't address this problem, this growing problem. So I know that our staff here sent a letter to which a response was sent that by February 20th, we would get a response. I don't have a copy of that letter, so I would also, in your response to me, I would like for you to include if you have taken the time to respond back to our
Sure.
committee.
There are a number of very important issues you've raised, and I appreciate the concern and share the concerns. With regard to the lack of people coming forward, that was really one of the primary focuses of our Workplace Conduct Working Group. The Chief Justice asked me to create a Workplace Conduct Working Group. I pulled together a group of 8 leaders from within the branch to examine our processes and procedures, make recommended changes and improvements to those processes and procedures. And we did so within a 6-month period, starting in January 2018, completing our suggestions by June of 2018. All of those recommendations have been adopted by the judicial branch now. And one of the primary focuses of the group was how do we ease the burden of registering a complaint and coming forward. And one of the ways we did so was to make it absolutely clear that retaliation for identifying a complaint or harassment is itself misconduct.
Can I stop you for a minute
Sure.
because our time is very limited? Is there an ability for a victim to transfer to a
Yes.
different court?
Yes, and we've done that. And with regard to your, I know your time's limited, but with regard to your question on the response to the letter, that's coming. We will be responding to it. We suggested a little more time because the matter in Kansas to which you referred has not been concluded yet.
In closing, we can't allow abusers to simply retire and collect on, a gross retirement while the victim is a victim forever and
Yes.
never got justice.
Yes, and
May I speak there are limitations on what we can say because of the ongoing.
I understand that.
But because I'm from the District of Kansas, I want to tell you that it was an absolute shock to the judges that this had occurred. And it actually kind of came to light to one of the judges from one of the clerks, and that started the process. And we have been extremely energetic in our efforts to work with those people who were the victims and those people who remain on Judge Murguia's staff post his leaving the judiciary. And in addition, he is not eligible for any benefits, pay, anything. As of April 1, he will get zero from the salary, benefits, anything else. And I think that's an important part of the record.
I thank you both for being here, and I look forward to reading your response.
thank you.
A few of our members may have a second question. We begin with Ms. Kirkpatrick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you again for being here. As you know, this is very important to my district. And this is more of a practical question, but it's been my observation that there's a perception that most of these people are coming from Mexico and they speak Spanish, which is not necessarily the case. So what I've learned is a lot of them are coming from Central America, Latin America, from tribal villages where they speak a very rare dialect, or maybe not even a dialect, their own tribal language. Just as a practical matter, what do you do for interpreters?
And you've identified another one of the huge problems is finding people who can interpret the indigenous languages or particular dialects of indigenous languages from various parts both of Mexico and Central America. And so, the judiciary's had to reach out into those communities in those countries even to find interpreting resources. That's very expensive. And that drives, again, part of the cost of processing cases on the southwest border. But that is something that we have, even in a district like Kansas, where it's not as an acute an issue, we find that exact same thing, where there may be a defendant who doesn't speak Spanish, even though they're from a predominantly Spanish-speaking country, and we have to find someone who speaks that particular. That's not easy, and it's very expensive. We can do it, but it's very expensive.
Yeah, I've just read the study that said that a lot of these workers are agriculture workers, and they are coming to places like Kansas to work on these farms, and it's become a huge problem just in terms of communicating with them. A lot of them are young men without families, and they really don't have those family ties. So it's a huge problem.
Many of them don't have much education, so that also makes it more difficult to try to work with some of the language that's used in legal communications and stuff like that. It is a very difficult problem. Again, thinking of it from a resource standpoint, which is why I'm here today, it definitely is a driver for cost needs or appropriations needs.
Thank you very much. Thank you both. I yield back.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for your participation. I'm just going to have one quick question. I wanted to clear something up, and then we'll close up. You don't have to make the argument that we need more money for additional defender services because the number of cases that's being filed and taking place is increasing. But I think there's some confusion as to if you have federal public defenders, why do you need a private panel as well? And why do judges fall to the panel at the same time? Are we keeping up with the requirements and the abilities of that panel? And is there anything else we can do to make sure it's funded as well?
That's really a good question. One of the main reasons why the panel attorneys are so important is in federal prosecutions, it is very common to have multi-defendant cases. I mean, the federal courts aren't dealing with somebody possessing small amounts of marijuana or something like that. Most of the prosecutions in federal court are large quantities involving multiple individuals distributing methamphetamine or heroin or these kinds of drugs. The Federal Defender's Office can only represent one of those defendants because otherwise they'd have a conflict of interest if they were representing more than one. I've handled cases myself with double-figure numbers of defendants. So that means you've got to recruit one Federal Defender's Office person and then a number of people from the private sector. And these cases are difficult. They're complex. And they require expertise. You don't just drag somebody off the street and say you've got a law degree once you come in here and defend this case. And so that's why the Defender's Office has put money into training, because they feel the obligation to make sure the panel attorneys are up to speed. Our federal defenders are awesome. They are wonderful. They do a great job.
Are the panel attorneys paid enough to be competitive to take these kind of difficult, expensive, sometimes very long cases?
It's better. You all, we are so appreciative of the fact that you brought that up. We're $1 short. We'd like
Just $1?
of the statutory
Okay,
maximum.
You'll
But that-
get the additional dollar. I promise.
And that's a statutory figure. So again, I kind of toss it back in your lap, raise it up, and we'll ask for more. But because the Judicial Conference policy is to ask for the max.
Very good. Mr. Graves, any closing words?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to thank the two guests today. It's always good to have you, and I think I speak on behalf of the entire panel how we appreciate your many years of service and your thoughtful responses today. I know it's at times difficult to do the jobs that each of us have, but I know yours has been tremendously difficult as well. But thanks again for joining us today and your preparation for today's hearing. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And before I give my thanks, and before we conclude, I need to ask unanimous consent to add a letter from the Federal Law Enforcement Officers Association addressed to myself and the ranking member to the record. No objection. Thank you. Gentlemen, thank you for your service. Thank you for attending today, and we look forward to continuing the relationship.
Thank you.
Take care. We are adjourned.